Hello, today we're here to talk to you about diversity in New York public high schools. Across our whole data set, we had 57 public schools that we utilized, and this is specifically from 2016 to 2017. The main dimensions that we utilized for our hypothesis was gender, grade, and race. The data set also included some other dimensions, but we chose not really to focus on those since those had very limited data points. The measures that we used for our data sets included percentages across the total enrollment, as well as the actual discrete amount of each student per school. Now, the graph on the right that you're seeing is the gender means across each school between females and males. The females, as you can see, distribution was a bit less than the males, and we'll go into more details about the specific mean, median, and mode later on. As you can see from this graph, there was also very few outliers, which again we'll discuss when we look into the kurtosis value. Looking at the descriptive statistics across females and males, as I mentioned earlier, the mean, the median, and the mode for both females and males hovered around 50%. The kurtosis value is very low here, and that is indicated as well in our whisker and box plot, which show that there was very few outliers. Now, when we were looking at this data set, it was important for us to analyze and do some conditional formatting to determine what hypotheses to use. From this formatting, which we did through Excel, we actually sorted it from the total enrollment. So you're actually seeing the schools with the highest number of enrollment on top. And we had some different coloring across the different fields so that we could see which schools had the highest for a specific race or the lowest for a specific gender, and which schools that corresponded to. Now, the red coloring you're seeing on the right is basically all the schools within these ethnic groups that had less than 10%. Now, this can be utilized by different decision makers for them to determine if certain schools might need special programming to help increase minority representation in those schools. Now, looking into the pre-processing needed for this data, because this is an open data set, there is going to be some missing and invalid data points to consider, and these were indicated by S or no data in the cell. So in order for us to utilize those columns, we had to go through and make sure we remove those values so that they didn't influence the data that we're seeing. Now, later on, Anthony will talk a little bit more about the limitations we faced while working with this data set. For now, I'll pass this on to Kelsing, who'll talk about our first hypothesis.
All right, thanks, Jacqueline. So for our first hypothesis, we will be testing whether the racial diversity of students in New York City high school is or should be proportional to the New York City racial demographic. For this hypothesis, our measure is number of students, dimension is race, and the sample size is 470 students. So we have two different pie charts. One on the left, you see it's a pie chart just extracted from our US Census, which details the racial diversity in New York City. And on the right, we have our own data from our report. The interesting thing we found was the white demographic was less and Asian was more. The white population in New York City is 42%, while they only account for 26% in their New York City high school population. Conversely, the Asian population is only 30.9% in New York City, but their New York City high school population is about 26%. Going beyond that, these findings can definitely be useful for institutions like New York City Department of Education because it can help them create curriculum or a special program in respect to the density of the certain demographic in each school. And from then, I'm going to pass on to Anthony, who's going to talk about the second hypothesis.
The second hypothesis that we chose to explore is to determine whether or not most students in temporary housing are male. The metric that we used was the number of male students. The dimension that we used was the category of temporary housing. And the various segments included the number of male students by school and the number of male students in temporary housing by school. Our findings proved the hypothesis true. On the right side here, we made a graphic in Tableau, which clearly illustrates that the number of male students in temporary housing is much higher than the number of female students in temporary housing. The chart modifications that we made were first making the chart start at 10,000 because we are dealing with a large number of students, and making it start at 0 would just take up a lot of space unnecessarily. Another chart modification that we made was updating the tick marks from 1,000 to 100 to more clearly articulate the variation between males and female students in temporary housing. And then the last chart modification that we made was adding a filter, which you can see on the far right, which allows you to sort by category, but displays the number of male and female students.
I'm going to talk here about our hypothesis number 3, more Asians selecting STEM careers versus art careers. And the metrics we use in this hypothesis are number of students enrolled, dimension we used, types of school, and the segment we use race and gender. And our hypothesis finds to be true in this case, and our findings are 22.8% Asians choosing STEM schools, which is highest percentage in STEM schools among all groups. At the same time, 5.2% choose art schools, which is also lowest in art schools among all student groups. We can tend to conclude that Asians join hard but rewarding STEM careers and avoid soft and uncertain art careers.
Hypothesis 4. Career outcomes for New York City high school students differ by race and gender. The utility of this exercise was to identify if certain race and gender groups take low-income majors in high school, leading to lower career incomes. Limitations we faced were data for private high schools not available. Only one variable, enrollment, was available. Data pre-processing was done, and schools providing only STEM or arts were identified. Majors were identified and included. In the visual, we can see that people with STEM careers earn higher salaries from start to mid-career. Enrollments in schools with only STEM and arts majors are used as differentiators, and enrollment data for white students is used as benchmark. As everyone knows, they are favored. Here we see that higher percentage of men are in tech fields than in arts, and higher percentage of women gravitate to enroll in art. Also, higher percentage of Asians are in tech fields compared to much lower blacks in tech. We see that 12% of women are in STEM fields and 13% are in arts. When the different segments were compared and the difference plotted, it was found that women and black are being pushed into lower paying jobs in the arts fields. The conclusions were STEM careers offer on average about 50% more income than arts careers. Females and African Americans are differentiated into lower paying majors. Thus, outcomes of New York City high school students differ by race and gender. Therefore, the null hypothesis is accepted. Further actions required: expand the study to include all New York City schools in STEM and arts majors. Look for differentiation between student groups before high schools.
In conclusion, we chose to conclude our presentation with descriptive analytics. The first was the usefulness of the data set that we had, which would allow managers and planners to properly allocate educational, human capital, and financial resources. This would include financial and educational resources to students in distressed categories, i.e. temporary housing. The limitations of the data include that it's not inclusive of all schools. It only includes public schools, not private schools or anything like that. The data is not the most recent. This is from the 2016 to 2017 school year. Additionally, the data could be incomplete. If the students are not reporting their situation accurately. Additionally, some students could be misrepresented or perhaps in a particular category for a short period of time, yet they would be counted for the entire school year. And finally, temporary is not defined in the category of temporary housing.